You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol for Medscape with my co-host Abraham Verghese for a new edition of Medicine and the Machine. We have an extraordinary guest today, Professor Christina Pagel. She is a professor at the University College in London, and she is a force. I mean, she's actually got an extraordinary background, which goes from math to physics, interplanetary space. I mean, it's actually really amazing. We've never had a guest with her diverse background like this. So welcome, Christina.
Thank you.
I guess I'd start off by, before we get into the pandemic, which you've provided, just extraordinary insights throughout. You've had this very unique background where you were a physicist, a mathematician, and then somewhere along the way, after this great training you had in the UK, you were in Boston, and you made a switch in your career from physics to using math and AI to help inform data for health. How did that come about?
Well, kind of in two ways. So originally, I studied maths at university because I wanted to be a theoretical physicist. That was kind of my aim, and I always knew the kind of maths is what you need to do that. And then I did a master's in quantum theory, and then all the bits of quantum theory that I really liked turned out to be solved. So I said, "Oh, can I do a PhD in this?" And I'm like, "No, it's been done. Like Feynman did it all like 30 years ago." And I was like, "Oh, great," So then I thought, well, actually, I'd also really like to kind of go into space and be an astronaut. And I spoke to the European Space Agency, and they said, "Oh, you need to do a PhD in space physics," which I'd never heard of. But then I went to Imperial in London College and said, "Can I do a PhD in this?" And they said yes. One of the benefits of doing maths is that it's actually quite easy to switch fields. So I did my PhD in kind of interplanetary magnetic fields, and then I came to Boston, as you said, for 3 years as a kind of postdoctoral researcher working on interplanetary electrons. And it was an amazing 3 years, but I guess I kind of realized two things. That firstly, I was quite good at maths, but I actually wasn't a great physicist, much to my disappointment. I just didn't have a feel for it in the way that some people did. And then also that what I was working on, although it was kind of cool, it didn't matter. Like if I got it wrong, or it didn't really make a difference. And I kind of felt like I wanted to feel that my work was doing that. I wanted to feel like I was contributing more to society than paying my taxes and not committing crimes, So then I was looking around and said, okay, what can I do? And I found this department at University College London where they were applying mathematics to healthcare. I could see that some people there had got a physics background. So I thought, actually, that sounds really, really interesting. And so I've been ever since. So that's kind of what happened.
Wow.
Dr. Pagel, it's a great pleasure to meet you and to read about you. And I was just thinking that most of us are so narrowly specialized, and we really need people like you to grasp the entirety of what's going on in this world. But I have a question before we get to COVID, and that is, you also have a master's in medieval history, and I'm delighted to see. But I'm sure there's a story behind that, and I don't doubt that it informs how you look at data.
Actually, I've got two history. I've got one history master's in classical civilization, which is like mainly the ancient Greeks and Romans, and then I went back and I did another one in medieval history, as you said. And the reason is that in the UK, you have to specialize at the age of 16 into three or four subjects. It's really narrow. And so when I was 16, I had to choose between an arts or a science path. And I really loved history and I loved science. And the thing is, once you kind of step off the science track, it's actually really hard to go back in. And so I picked science, but I never lost my love for history. And actually, one of the advantages of history is that you can dip back in. You can not study it for years and then go back and do a master's. And I just absolutely loved it. It's the first time I'd ever learned something and chosen to do a course purely for interest. had no impact on my career, and you're only doing it for yourself. And actually it kind of takes you back to the meaning of what learning is, I think, of trying to understand and find out, and it's just so interesting. And so that's kind of where that happened. And I realized that actually that having a mathematical background actually makes you quite good at history. It kind of teaches you to look for what's not there as well as what's there. That's kind of what maths gives you, and to kind of create logical arguments and to understand, that causation isn't correlation, which I think is actually really important in history. And so I've done 2 of them, and I've definitely got another one in my future at some point. I'm not sure when.
I think it's actually very relevant to COVID and everything that you're engaged in, because Santayana said that if we don't understand history, we're condemned to repeat it. And, I think we're seeing a lot of that going on here, Eric.
Well, I guess before we get right into the pandemic, where I have to say, by the way, if you don't follow Chris Chirp, then you're missing out in terms of COVID people with experts with insight. I mean, she is a go-to for information and for perspective. But before the pandemic started, you were, and still do, I think, a lot of work with understanding congenital heart disease, cardiac surgery in children and adult. And I suspect much more than that. But as a cardiologist, I cue into that stuff. Can you tell us about what that work has been like, and how that kind of was a background for some things that you're doing now?
Yeah, so it's actually been now about almost 15 years I've been working in congenital heart disease. And it all kind of starts with 2 facts about the UK. So the first is that it is a national healthcare system, and that means that you can organise things at a national scale. And the second thing is that in 1997, there was what was called the Bristol heart scandal. And it turned out that one of the hospitals that performed heart surgery in babies had much higher than expected mortality rates in children compared to other units that were doing the same kind of operations. And that took a long time to kind of come to light, because it's obviously a high risk, highly specialized specialty. So you would expect, unfortunately, that some children will die. So then you have this whole question of, well, how many is too many? What does expected even mean when you have this group of children that have such diverse health problems and diagnoses and all these diverse procedures that happen to them? And so after that kind of came to light, what the NHS said is, okay, we're going to centralize the service. So only about 10 to 12 hospitals offer it, and they do that because they want to ensure that there are enough operations happening every year. And also they made it mandatory that everybody has to submit their data centrally. It gets audited, the data gets checked, and then every year they publish survival statistics on the grounds that actually we don't want this to happen again. And that's been going on since 2000. And that's meant that congenital heart disease services are actually one of the best areas if you have a long-standing data set. And so over the years, what we've done is we've kind of refined the risk models for deciding, okay, well, how risky are these surgeries for different children? How do we know whether some of the units have higher deaths than average or not? Actually, in fact, we can show that since they've started monitoring, results have got better every single year, pretty much. But also now that the field has really come on, as I'm sure you know, we're looking more like, well, what other things matter? It's not just about survival, it's about complications, quality of life. How many surgeries do you need over your lifetime? What happens in outpatients? How are people engaging with it? What happens as children become adults? And so we're using these national data sets now that we have here to really dig into it, and actually requires quite a lot of careful statistics, data, but also talking to clinicians, talking to patients, talking to parents. So we've also involved kind of building websites, trying to explain what the data is showing and isn't showing. So that's kind of how I started thinking about how do we present information that matters to people in a way that they find easy to understand and that's fair.
May I ask one more question before we get into COVID, and that is your work in operational research, and I'm wondering, is that a common department now in many universities, and what is the day-to-day life of a operations researcher like for our listeners who I suspect, like me, are this is all new.
Yeah, so unfortunately, so few people know what operational research is. It's a branch, technically, of mathematics, but it can sit in lots of different places. So in the States, it's often called operations research. It's also called systems engineering, and then it often actually sits within engineering faculties. It can also be called management science, and is often taught, part of it is often taught as part of, say, MBAs, right? So it kind of runs this whole gamut of different subjects and different techniques. But the core of it is you want to use mathematics and data and any kind of other analytical techniques to improve decision making. That's the idea. So it's meant to be very pragmatic, very focused on working with people to understand what is the actual problem that you have, because it's often not what people say they have. Where is it you want to get to? What information do we have? And how can we use that to improve that decision that you're about to make? So that is kind of the core of it. And then there are kind of standard techniques that people use, things like optimization or queuing theory or mathematical modeling or simulation. But really the heart of OR is that you're trying to improve things. And the techniques you use actually aren't part of it. It's just that there are certain ones that are more common than others.
Yeah, actually, that sets up this, now that we're getting into the pandemic, so well, because this is a unique background. Fresh eyes, transdisciplinary experience, intergalactal from all the way to understanding health systems, right? Okay, so now let's get into the third year of the pandemic. You've been a leading light, a spokesperson for your views and data interpretation, not just in the UK, but throughout the world. I wonder if you could just give us an overview, because obviously it hasn't gone well in many respects. What do you think are the key takeaways, concerns that you have?
About the UK response or about global response?
Maybe both, where you see the UK, if at all, an outlier or different than other places like the US, which is perhaps even worse.
I guess there are a few things that kind of stand out to me, kind of big picture. One of those is that right at the beginning, the rich countries, the Western rich countries, actually weren't prepared. And I think we thought we were, and I think there was an element of complacency that we knew what to do. And this idea, well, we have world-leading health systems, so of course we'll be fine. And actually that wasn't the case. And I think part of that is that as societies become more medicalized, as we've had, vaccinations, treatments, healthier lives, we've got very used to growing life expectancy and actually quite not as many infectious diseases, and not as many kind of ubiquitous public health problems. So actually, I think we got quite complacent about what an infectious disease can do to a population. And we had let our public health functions lapse. And so certainly in the UK, there wasn't actually that much public health expertise. The public health bodies were much smaller than they used to be, and people just weren't ready. Whereas, say, in some of the middle and lower income countries that have really strong public health systems that are trying to deliver, say, large-scale vaccination nutrition programs, they had much better setup to actually do things like contact tracing, to do things like supporting people who are ill, to actually think about, okay, well, how do we mobilize a population response? And the other thing that kind of struck me is how unwilling the West was to learn from other countries. So that's both, particularly the East Asian countries, particularly places like, say, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. We just felt like they had nothing to teach us. And I think that was a big mistake. And I think that's still the case today. And people talk about the inevitability of COVID. I mean, you only have to look at those countries to see how it wasn't inevitable. And these kind of quite lazy stereotypes, oh, well, that wouldn't work over here because they're different. I'm like, well, how do you know? And actually what made those countries quite different is that a lot of them experienced SARS, and they learned from that and applied that knowledge to this new pandemic. And what worries me is that I don't feel like we're in that situation at all. We're not trying to learn from COVID and going to apply it to a new pandemic. So I guess those are kind of two things from the beginning. And then the other thing that really struck out is that you can understand the panic and the mistakes in the way that happened in the first wave in March 2020. But then by the time that the alpha wave hit in late 2020, early 2021, it felt like not that much had been learned. And we didn't mitigate it, particularly things around transmission and about being airborne. By the summer of 2020, it actually was reasonably clear that it could spread through the air. It was clear that masks helped. It was clear that ventilation helped. It was clear that outside conditions were much safer than inside. And there was so little effort made to improve indoor air quality. And that, to this day, I just do not understand, because it comes with it so many more public health benefits than just COVID, right? Clean indoor air is just a public good along the same lines as clean water. So I just can't understand why we've never prioritized it.
I'm going to ask you to take that a bit further. And you were pretty prescient about the shape of the BA5 and how that might look a couple of months before we actually knew. What is your crystal ball of what we can expect both in the UK and the US in terms of, I know that's very hard with new variants not yet emerging, but nonetheless.
Yeah, so the other thing that strikes me is that people still haven't understood exponential growth of 2.5 years in. So like things like BA5 or BA2 before it or Omicron before that, people are like, oh, how did you know? And I was like, well, because it was dominating every week. And I projected forwards, and in 8 weeks, it's dominant. Like, it's not that hard. It's just people don't believe it. Somehow people kind of think, oh, well, it can't happen. It's like, well, what exactly is going to stop it? Right? So you have to have a mechanism to stop exponential growth. And at the moment, it's when enough people get immunity, it doesn't last very long. And you get these kind of repeated waves. And equally, when people say, oh, well, are there going to be new waves? You have to have a mechanism that you think is going to stop it evolving. And I don't see that. We're not doing anything different to what we were doing a year ago or 6 months ago. So yeah, it's still evolving. There are still new variants shooting up all the time. At the moment, there's nothing that looks devastating. So I think at the moment, we've probably got at least 6 weeks breathing space. But yeah, it'll come, because I can't see that we're doing anything to stop it coming.
Right, exactly. It's almost, one word you mentioned already was complacency, which we still have a lot of, a heavy dose of complacency. The other one that I think you're invoking by the unwillingness to accept exponential growth is denialism. There's a lot of that. So long COVID is another area where it's a softer endpoint than death and hospitalizations, but nonetheless, it's much more prevalent and real, but there's still a lot of denialism. And it's harder perhaps about the data-driven aspects. Can you comment about long COVID?
Long COVID is a really interesting one because, it took a long time for a lot of people to accept that it existed at all. And now it still gets, as you say, it still gets dismissed and ignored. I think part of the reason it gets dismissed and ignored is because there is no way you can live with the really high levels of infection we've been seeing and think it's okay if you acknowledge that long COVID is a problem, because vaccination has not made that go away in the same way that vaccination has massively reduced the number of deaths that we're seeing or the number of very severe acute illnesses. It has certainly, I think there's another paper just out today in Jolla from Italy showing that vaccination reduced it by about a third. Or 2/3, I can't remember exactly what it was, in healthcare workers. So it helps, but it certainly doesn't make it go away. And I think part of denialism is that actually you have to stop thinking that you can only intervene using vaccination if long COVID matters. And I think what worries me just as much as long COVID is the kind of longer term problems that are becoming evident from COVID through this great work that, say, the VA are doing, looking at kind of 1 year plus follow-up of people who've had COVID and showing, elevated levels of organ dysfunction pretty much anywhere you look. And that's the other kind of thing about complacency, is that people think, oh, they want to fit COVID into a box that they understand, and it's this brand new disease, and we just don't understand it. Like with the pandemic flu in 1918, it's thought to have been associated with kind of a wave of Parkinson's about 10 to 15 years later. Like, we have no idea if we have that kind of thing ahead of us. And to me, this idea that we can live with really widespread transmission is betting the future on thinking that we get it. And there's no particular evidence that we have. All the new evidence coming out is showing that there were longer term issues with COVID, whether that's long COVID or other kind of organ problems.
Right.
I must say, I look to both of you for keeping up with COVID. Your information is so helpful. And one of the things that strikes me is that we're not talking enough, except for the two of you, about indoor air and the difference it makes, and about long COVID, in the sense that if the public really knew how fearful we are, perhaps it would change behavior. And I wondered, from your perspective as someone with a deep understanding of history, this is not new, this sort of disjunction between what we know would help and the public's willingness to accept it, and political sort of opportunism. What can we do differently than, say, in the era of Camus' The Plague, for example? Or what can we do to impact this sort of science ignorance that actually hurts us?
I mean, I wish I knew. I think there are some things we can do. I think the thing about cleaner indoor air is that it works on any variant and any airborne disease. That it helps concentration, it helps against pollution, like it helps against all kinds of things, and it doesn't take away anyone's freedoms. So what I find sometimes difficult is that people on the so-called kind of, I don't know, COVID isn't a problem type spectrum still don't seem to be very pro-ventilation. And I just cannot understand why, because it doesn't impact anybody's freedom, it doesn't impact anybody's choice of living a life. All it does is it makes people slightly healthier and mitigate some harms. So I can't quite see why we wouldn't do that. And the various studies that have been done on it, and there have been many, actually show that it's extremely cost effective. I think one of the issues is that a lot of the experts in ventilation are not doctors or clinical experts. They're engineers, architects, kind of chemists and physicists. So they're coming from a different evidential paradigm, if you like. So you get these kind of calls for trials of ventilation, and they're like, literally, I understand the physics, right? We know these things work. And it's kind of quite a clash of cultures along those lines there, that I think that is a bit of an issue. And then people kind of see the pandemic and they think the solution has to be medical, and actually when the solution is engineering, it doesn't fit into how governments have kind of primed themselves to respond. And I don't know, like for individuals, I think it is a problem. I think now that, most people have had COVID and most people have recovered from COVID, including me. I've had it twice now. When people then tell you, oh my God, there's this massive issue, you kind of think, well, I'm fine. And it's very, very hard to kind of overcome that and explain that, okay, well, you're fine now, but we don't know what the long-term implications are. And actually, is it a question of getting COVID, 3 times in 5 years or 6 years, or is it twice a year, right? And that can be quite different for your health. And actually, when you start saying, do you really want to be taking a week, 10 days off work every single year from COVID? Can you add that to the amount of illness you were suffering before? I think then there's a really strong economic argument for it as well. And I think maybe we have to start making those arguments and kind of, because it is a different situation now, right? We're not in the situation we were 2.5 years ago. And I think sometimes people feel that when you say anything about controlling COVID, they think you're arguing for lockdowns or something else, when it's not about that. It's about, okay, how do we maintain our economy and our quality of life and our health in a way that allows us also to enjoy our lives in the way that we want to.
Right. Now, one of the things that you've done among many activities in this stretch has been on the SAGE committee, an independent committee of the UK. I wonder if you could tell us, I think the acronym is also in keeping with the wisdom of the group, but can you tell us about how that group reviews things and makes recommendations to your government?
Right. Okay. So there is a bit of a misunderstanding there, and I think if we could name ourselves again, it'd be different. So there's SAGE, which is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, which is the government's group of experts that does advise on the pandemic, and have now been disbanded. We're disbanded in March, and at some point, comprised probably hundreds of people contributed to that at some point.
Mm.
And then there's this group that I'm on, which is called Independence Age, and that was launched in May 2020. And it was launched specifically because at the beginning of the pandemic, membership of the stage who were advising the government and all the minutes of the decision making were secret. And so we had the government saying, we're making decisions based on the science, but we had no idea what that science was. And so it was formed to kind of try and bring out some of those discussions into the public. But then they did start making it public. And so since then, we've kind of, but then what happened was that the government used to be holding daily press briefings on COVID, and they stopped in June 2020. And then there was really, although the UK has been really admirable in publishing lots of data, we have really strong national data surveillance. It's not necessarily published in a particularly friendly form for non-experts. And so what we've been doing since then is holding weekly online briefings. And I've done a lot of this as well, where I try and collate all of the data that's out there and explain what's happening right now and what it means. So we've kind of evolved into kind of being a bit more of a public-facing science body, where we're trying to explain and interpret what's happening for the public, and we take public's questions and kind of focus on particular issues like schools or inequality, long COVID, we've talked about a lot, children.
I wish we had something like this, right, Abraham?
Indeed. But I must say, both of you are doing a great job of explaining the intricacies of the data to the rest of us. It's just that people with fixed mindsets can easily tune out the most obvious fact. Nevertheless, I think, Christina, you've done such a great job of explaining things to those of us who follow you, and Eric the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I rely on Eric so much, especially, the kind of literature filtering. I mean, it's really incredible how you kind of read the papers and then condense them so that I can understand them. I think what I try and do, and I think it does help that I have an interdisciplinary background, and that I'm not an expert in a lot of it. So I have to understand it. And I go to my expert friends and I say, you're going to have to tell me what this abstract means, because I do not understand virology. And then they kind of explain it. And I go, okay, so this is right. And they kind of say yes. I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of Twitter, academic Twitter, that is either people who are really, really, really amazing scientists, but cannot understand how much knowledge they have that other people don't have. And so actually, I read these long Twitter threads and I really don't understand them. Or there are people who are very much into kind of performative cleverness, and you think that's their job as an academic, is to show how clever they are. And so again, I don't think their information is that useful. So I try really hard to make so that people are kind of can see what the situation is, and I try and do it with Charles, but I always try and provide source data, but I try and make sure that I'm not excluding people from that knowledge, if you like.
Yeah, and that gets a bit to the dissemination of the information. So what is so important about your background is you are into the hard data evidence interpretation of that, the analytics, if you will. Then you go to social media, and then you go into the cesspool of toxic responses. And by putting a lot of time into trying to help, you get this ridiculous backlash of people who are just there to cause, basically insult and trouble. How do you deal with that? Because I know, at least for me, every day I wonder what the hell am I doing? Because there's so much negativism. You're trying to help, and you're putting in the effort and time, and then look what you get. Of course, there was a lot of people who appreciate that, but obviously you're subject to, I'm sure, similar issues as many of us are.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's definite is that it's got a lot easier over time, actually, for me. And I imagine for you, I think, certainly once you get to a certain number of followers, there's no way you can read all the comments. Actually, I don't read them. Yeah, and it means that the Twitter stops being a conversation. It becomes more of a broadcast medium, and you lose something from that. But at the same time, you can't get too worried about what random people are saying. And the other thing is that right at the beginning, one of my friends who already had a large following, he's into politics, and he just said, never, ever get engaged in Twitter arguments. You will always regret it, and it'll never work. And I mainly followed his advice. A couple of times when I didn't, I regretted it, and I still regret it because those conversations are still used against me now. People will bring out a screenshot from 2020, which was actually quite a mild screenshot, but they'll say, oh, look, you can't talk because you said X, and I'm like, okay, no, never get engaged. And if you do, always pretend that the person, if most people are doing it, a lot of people are doing it in bad faith, but if you respond as if they weren't, there's actually not that much people can do. And you have really good mute settings. And again, for the first year, I didn't block anyone on Twitter, but then that changed when actually I was kind of reading more about how Twitter works and how people see things and how things get amplified. And I had a few quite high profile, quite horrible commentators on Twitter causing pylons on me, people with like 1 million followers calling me like certifiable and I should be in prison, blah, blah. And then it gets quite, and then if you block them, then their followers can't see it. And you just stop it. And then someone said to me, they said, if you just see it like, if you're walking down the street and someone crosses it and starts shouting at you, you don't have to listen to it, right? You have a right to walk away from it. And so now I have quite a low threshold for blocking people, because I'm like, if they're clearly not trying to engage or be helpful and are just shouting at me to fuck off or whatever, then I don't have to listen to it. Yeah. And that's all it is. And I've never really taken it that personally, because people, they don't know me. It's been a really hard pandemic. People are angry and upset for all kinds of reasons, and I get that. And I find it much harder when there've been other scientists that are attacking me, maybe more politely. But I find that harder because they're my peers and they're basically trying to damage my reputation, and I find that a lot more difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
I must say, I see a lot of undergraduates at Stanford, very narrowly focused on computer science, which is, the flavor du jour right now. And I think your career has been a wonderful testament to the importance of a sort of a broad perspective, not just math, but astronomy and history. I think we're going to need more of your kind of educated people for the complexity of what we're dealing with. It's just not going to be possible otherwise to have civilized conversations,
Well, I hope so, because a lot of the time I end up being like a complete idiot. I'm like, I'm not this super specialized person. So I'm like, oh my God, I don't know anything. And I've always got my mum as well telling me, why is anyone listening to you, Christina? Haven't you said it all already? And I was like, yeah. Keeps you down to earth.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to touch on before we wrap up. One is, I had the real privilege of doing an NHS review a couple of years back, and it was just before the pandemic in 2018, 2019, and I was struck by I think strong data-driven culture of the people, the team I got to work with. And I saw it during the pandemic with the UK Health Security Agency, ONS reports that would come out every week, and the ICNARC of all the ICU and admissions. Stuff we don't have here in the United States. Just extraordinary. And then the government just gave up on all this stuff. It seems like it was premature. They were leading the world. We were all learning every day, every week from the UK because the data was so extraordinary. Can you comment about that?
It is really sad, because I think you're right. I think one area in which the UK has been world leading is in surveillance, particularly the random testing surveillance, which the ONS did, and actually is still doing, and also the Imperial RAG study, which unfortunately was not refunded and ended in April this year. I do think it's short-sighted. Now, some national data collection, like things like ICNARC, existed before the pandemic. It exists now. It routinely collects data on every single intensive care admission in adults in England and publishes reports on it. The same with pediatric intensive care, the same with every hospital admission. Like, we have that data. And what happened during the pandemic is that they quickly added extra information relevant to COVID. Mm-hmm. So we could let you know within days and weeks, they started collecting it. So that capability is still there. Mm. I think one of the things I've actually found so frustrating is that our surveillance has been so good that it's often felt that we were watching and reporting on the pandemic incredibly carefully, but not actually acting on any of the information that it was showing. So in that sense, you're kind of got a very, very expensive system that's not informing any decisions because the decisions have been made, and that's to stop trying to mitigate COVID, really, ever since February, really. So I'm guessing that's what prompted it. It's like, well, we're not going to do anything different, so why are you measuring it? But I think it's I really, really hope that the ONS infection survey, which measures prevalence in a random subgroup of tens of thousands of people every week, carries on, because that's the only thing we've got still, and it's one of the only global measures of national long COVID rates as well.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted just to get your sense about is the field of AI in healthcare. So you obviously have the grounding with all aspects of machine learning and the complexities of health data, which is not just from health records, but all the different layers of data, the sensors and genomics and microbiome. I mean, there's lots of different data sets. Where do you see AI? What can it do, in your view, in improving healthcare in the future?
So I think it can do both more and not as much as what people think. I think people sometimes think it's this great savior. It isn't. Sometimes what you need is enough nurses and equipment and just old-fashioned doctoring, and AI is never going to give you that. I think what AI is incredibly good at is taking very complex data and using it to understand what's happening, but only if the data contains what is happening. So it's actually really, really good at things like imaging.
Yeah.
And we've seen that, like, the only places really AI is currently used in the NHS is for things like imaging. If you're looking at, say, scans and you want to look for a tumor or a difference, then it's actually very, very good at pattern recognition. I mean, that's what it's built for. And in a sense, all of the information is contained in that image. What AI is less good at is using routine healthcare, which is messy and dirty and is subject to lots of biases as to, who put it in, at what time, in which place, how has that changed over time, and what is it actually telling you about the patient or the system. And there it isn't as good. And it's also the information of what's in there doesn't necessarily tell you about the future, which is what people are trying to use it for. So we can't really predict, say, occupancy in a year's time, because what's going to cause occupancy in a year's time is not contained in that data. And AI can't make that happen for you. So I think sometimes you have to realize there are limitations to what it can do. I think some really important areas where it could still help more is actually in things like time series data, physiological time series data. And we're doing a project on that now where you have incredibly complex data. So, patients in ICU have measurements taken, multiple times a second for days on end. And we still don't really understand that much about how patients get better when they're severely ill. So you can see a situation there where AI could really help trying to firstly spot early deterioration or spot when patients are ready to leave ICU, all kinds of other things. But as it turns out, when I'm working with the kind of AI specialists, like time series, it just adds a whole extra level of complexity and actually makes a lot of the normal ways of doing things don't work because your assumptions are violated of independence, everything's correlated. So it becomes really, really difficult. But that, I think, is could be a really, really big thing.
Well, we've really enjoyed this conversation. And I think the contributions you've made in the last few years, beyond everything else in your career, Christina, have been what I consider positive outlier, actually even momentous, I would say. And I think we've all learned from you, and we're very lucky to have someone of your background to be a leading force. So we're going to keep following you well beyond the pandemic for things that you're going to do to help healthcare. We're very glad that you switched from physics to healthcare. That's already made a big difference, and it's going to make even more difference in the decades ahead. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.